Welcome to the Daily Plunge. We are in the Gospel, Matthew chapter 23, verses 27 through 39. Jesus is continuing to basically curse the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, for leading people into death, away from the grace of God. And he says to you, you hypocrite teachers, you're nothing more than whitewashed tombs. You're nothing more than beautiful wood furniture, a casket, but all you do is contain death on the inside. You're made up of dead bodies because you believe in a works righteousness that can only lead to death, and that only kills you more the more you walk away from God's grace. And this rebellion against God's grace is your uncleanliness. And you're unrighteous. You are really unliving because you're not living by God's grace. You're living by your works, which can only lead to death. And you're unrepentant. And so that's who you are. You appear righteous on the outside, but inside you're filled up with hypocrisy and wickedness, unrighteousness. And, he goes on in verse 29, woe to you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you build tombs, you build memorials to the prophets, over their graves, right? And yet you desecrate the graves of the righteous. And so on the one hand, he says, you say, oh, we honor the prophets, but you don't, because you say, well, if it was us, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. And again, they are preoccupied with death. That's why we're talking about cemeteries and graves. But he says, you're just like your forefathers who put these prophets to death. You trust more in the power of death to silence those who speak against your way of life, which is unrighteous, than you do trust in the living God. And you say, well, if we had lived, this is verse 30, if we had lived, we wouldn't have killed them. But that's just not true, because this world of legalistic religiosity, whether it's of a faith or paganism or secularism, hates the prophets who point out their religious fallacies, their works righteous religiosity, and how it all leads to death, and hates them for their calling them to repentance and to turn towards the God of life. And he says, you testify, just by saying this, you testify against yourself. He goes down in verse 35 to talk about from Abel all the way to Zechariah. Well, Abel is, he was killed by his brother Cain because Cain's worship was self-serving, self-congratulatory, and he hated Abel for his true worship. And then Zechariah, he was the prophet, after the time of the exile, already they're back to religiosity, and he calls them out on it, and so they kill him. And this is why he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long to gather you. I want you to come to grace like you are my children, but instead you want a desolate house of religiosity, of self-glorification and self-works. And this is the sign of the coming of the ages, that this is going to come to an end. Well, hey, thanks, friends. If you like the content of the Daily Plunge, like, subscribe, share. Have a blessed day.